Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to a bonus episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. This episode is just a bunch of strung together short stories about some of the humorous antics that the CIA have come up with over the years. There's not really enough source material out there behind these stories to really create a dedicated episode to, so they get thrown together in a compilation bonus episode, so enjoy. So we're going to start off with a favorite of mine, Project Acoustic Kitty, and it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. They wanted to train cats to spy on people outside of the Soviet embassy. And for context, this was a $20 million project. So this is in the 1960s, and basically the gist is, Washington, D.C., downtown, they have all the embassies there, and the Soviet embassies, right there. And outside all the embassies are the little parks and grounds and little benches you can sit on, and, And the basic gist is kind of that trope you see from all those spy movies. You got two agents sitting there, or in this case, it would be two employees or two diplomats of the Soviet embassy sitting out there on a park bench next to each other. And it's like, well, what are they talking about? We need to figure out what they're talking about. So the CIA, they get this idea, we can't just waltz over there and listen in on a conversation. That's too suspicious. So they go to probably the guy at the CIA who's probably half drunk and comes up with all their insane little schemes. They most likely go to him and they're like, so we got this situation. We got people sitting outside the park bench, outside the Soviet embassy. We want to know what they're talking about. And the guy is like, I got the perfect idea. Let's put a microphone in a cat. And I just imagine this is just like some drunk guy that came up with this idea, because this is the kind of stupid idea I would come up with. And the CIA guys, they're like, oh my god, that's an awesome idea. Yeah, so let's expand on that. So let's put like a little microphone in the cat's ear canal, and then a little radio transmitter back there at the base of the skull, and then like run a wire down the back. And we'll send Acoustic Kitty out because nobody's going to notice another random stray cat just walking around, and then we can listen in on these conversations from these Soviet diplomats. Great. I hope that guy got a raise. So they plan it all out, and Acoustic Kitty as it go. So they get a hold of this veterinary surgeon, and he's probably like the CIA's go-to veterinary surgeon who also will like remove a bullet from you without asking any questions. They're like, hey, can you do this? And he's like, okay. So over the course of an hour, he does this surgery on this cat, and it has a little microphone in its ear canal and a little radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and then there's just kind of a wire running down his back. And in the meantime, leading up to this surgery, they've been trying to train this cat to just like kind of wander over to this area. But here's where it all kind of falls apart. Cats, they're not really all that trainable. They kind of do whatever they want. As Hemingway once stated, cats are the perfect example of an anarchist. I'm paraphrasing, of course. So they go to release Acoustic Kitty, the first Acoustic Kitty, out into the wild. Well, Acoustic Kitty just kind of wanders out into traffic and gets hit by a taxi. Now, that's the urban legend part of it. It states that Acoustic Kitty probably saw a mouse, ran out across the street, and got hit by a taxi. That was refuted later. In 2013, a man named Robert Wallace, who was the former director of the Office of Technical Service, he stated that the taxi incident didn't happen. And in fact, Acoustic Kitty number 1 just kind of wandered off, and I guess some CIA guy had to probably spend 2 hours chasing him down, because you know how freaking hard it is to catch a cat. And according to him, the radio acoustic equipment was removed from Acoustic Kitty number 1, and he lived out a long and happy life. Which, if that's the case, good for him. Acoustic Kitty ain't no narc. But it's said that there were further Acoustic Kitties, not just this one. And the same kind of problems would arise, so the cats would get distracted, they'd wander off, they wouldn't always go towards the targets. Sometimes they would go towards the targets, but the background noise of the city and all the craziness would kind of drown out the conversation, so they weren't really successful in anything. Eventually, by 1967, the project was canceled. A closing memo stated that the CIA researchers believed that they could train cats to move short distances, but but the environmental and security factors in using this technique in a real foreign situation forced them to conclude that the acoustic kitty project was not practical. But to me, it's kind of funny to think that it took them $20 million to realize that you can't train a cat to do jack shit. Cats basically just do whatever the hell they want, and I can't believe it took them almost 7 years to figure that out, but I digress. So that's the story of Acoustic Kitty, one of the CIA's more humorous projects. But another really funny thing that the CIA did was all of their assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. And reading through some of these stories and attempts, it reads like an old Looney Tunes cartoon, kind of like Tom and Jerry or Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. Some of these assassination attempts were downright wacky, so obviously we have to talk about that. So for those of you who don't know, let's lay down some context. Fidel Castro, he was a Cuban revolutionary and politician who was the leader of Cuba from 1959 till 2008. And he was a communist. After the Cuban Revolution, he aligns Cuba with the Soviet Union, and this pisses off the Americans, and they're still pissed off today about it. That's why we still have a trade embargo on Cuba. And I'm not going to dive into U.S.-Cuban relations because it's just way too complex. But essentially, America doesn't like Fidel. America doesn't like having a communist-leaning nation 90 miles from its shore. And America being America, they're like, you know what? Why don't we just eliminate Castro and then we can install our own puppet dictator and get them back to good old-fashioned capitalism. But not real capitalism like corporate America bullshit corporatism style capitalism. That's what we want. So in order to do this, we go to our old friends at the CIA, with minor supporting roles going to the Department of Defense and the State Department. We can't leave those guys out, but the CIA gets all the credit and limelight for this. So it's said that throughout Castro's reign over Cuba, there were over 600 attempts on his life, many of them orchestrated and planned by CIA operatives. And for whatever reason or another, call it divine intervention, call it, I don't know, just really good luck, he escapes assassination every time. An early attempt wasn't even an assassination plot, it was just a plot to oust him. So they knew that Castro would go to this radio station and give like these radio talks to the people of Cuba. And they create this aerosol spray. It's like an LSD but aerosolized. And they're like, we're going to spray this room with this aerosolized LSD concoction. And he's going to go in there, he's going to start tripping balls on the radio, and people are going to lose confidence in him. And for whatever reason that fails, probably because in order to do that, even if it were a small room, you would have to really heavily aerosolize that room. So maybe this plan fell apart because it wasn't practical. An early attempt at assassination came from the fact that Castro had a love for diving, and he particularly liked diving for shells, so like conch shells and other pretty shells that you find on the seafloor. So the CIA, they decided that they were going to create this wetsuit. And the wetsuit would be obviously presented to Castro by one of the spies who was undercover, on the boat or something. And this wetsuit was lined with the tuberculosis virus, and it was thought that we can infect him with tuberculosis and it would kill him slowly over time. Well, that doesn't happen. I don't know, maybe Castro had a TB shot. Who knows? Another attempt that came from his love of diving was the CIA. They took this conch shell, and it was this very beautiful, unique-looking conch shell, so they knew that if Castro were diving in this area, that he would see that shell and he would pick it up and take it home or whatever. However, the shell was booby-trapped to explode the moment he went to go pick it up. Now, for one reason or another, I couldn't really figure out the reason why, but that plan never manifested. Other attempts including the poisoning of his food, poison pills, poison pens, and the infamous exploding cigar. However, it's believed that the exploding cigar, along with the poisoned cigars that were sent early in his reign, never actually reached him. I imagine if they weren't discovered, they were probably like swiped by a secretary or something, and that secretary had a very bad day afterwards. But the last attempt on Castro's life comes in 2000. He was given this speech in, I believe it was Panama, and somebody had rigged the podium with 90 kilograms of explosives. But luckily for him, his private security team found it before he ever got to the stage. Castro went on to state that if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, he would be a gold medalist, and that's true. The dude miraculously survived so many assassination attempts that it kind of makes you wonder how many of those were fictionalized for his own propaganda, but I digress. But this is nothing compared to a very humorous little spy trick that a lot of CIA operatives would do in order to get rid of tails. So imagine you're in Moscow and you're a spy and you have to get to a meeting, but you have a tail on you. You got some KGB agent following you. Well, you got to lose this guy somehow. Now, there are some traditional ways to lose tails. A lot of people will duck into like a nearby gay sex club or something like that because, the KGB guys, they'd be too prudish or scared to go in there. Some people could lose tails in more mundane ways, like just disappearing into a crowd if you're really good at that. And there's all these kinds of ways, but the funniest way they've ever done it was they would use sex dolls. So imagine you're in the passenger seat of a car and you got your buddy there and he's driving you to where the secret spy meeting is supposed to be. And you got a tail following you, and this tail's been following you for a while, and you're coming up close to where your safe house is or where this operative is or whoever you got to meet, right? So you're sitting there in the passenger seat of the car and you have a briefcase on your lap. So your driver takes this corner, and while he's taking this corner, you're able to quickly slip out, but you leave the briefcase behind. Because this briefcase contains what was known as the jack-in-the-box, or the jib. So while you're taking off down the alley, the guy in the driver's seat, he deploys the jib. So he essentially opens up the briefcase, and like an airbag explosion, this sex doll just like inflates in the passenger seat. And it being a dark night, to the KGB agents who are tailing you, it just looks like there's two people just sitting in the car. And this was surprisingly successful. They were able to deploy the jib many times in many situations and scenarios, and it would trick these KGB agents. But of course, I think the funniest part of the story comes from the guy who originally came up with the idea of all this. He was I think he was a film producer, or he worked in film. I just looked it up. He was a costume specialist. And he actually worked with the CIA in the past before this, and that work became the movie Argo, which was a 2012 film about the CIA making a fake film in Iran during the Iranian hostage crisis, but I digress. But he would later go on to state that the worst part about it was that when they were kind of coming up with this idea, he had to find and source sex dolls. And he stated that he had this secretary who was very demure, and he could have sent her, but he really didn't want to send her to a sex shop. So he went out and got them himself. So while creating the prototype, he finds this adult bookstore that's local to the area, and he goes in, he purchases a sex doll, because of course they have them. They create the prototype and it's successful. However, they need more of this because they have multiple agents in the field who have this exact same problem. And he said that over the next several weeks, he had to go back to the store buying 4 or 5 at a time. And obviously, he can't tell the clerks in there what he's actually doing with these things. He later goes on to state that he's sure that he managed to obtain some kind of reputation because you know how rumors get started. I imagine this guy, whenever he showed up at this sex shop, he was probably just getting the weirdest looks when he was buying 5 or 6 of these at a time. But sticking with that theme, let me tell you one last story. This is about the time the CIA got into the porn business. So this takes place in the 1950s. 1950s, and the Indonesian president at the time was this man named Sukarno, who was very anti-Western. He was pro-communist, and those pro-communist leanings weren't really sitting well with some of the higher-ups here in the good old US of A. But instead of assassinating this guy or destabilizing political unity in the region or any of that other stuff that the CIA is actually really good at, Castro and Cuba being the exception, they decide they're going to discredit him, and they're going to do this by kind of destroying his image, and they decide that the best way to do that is to create a sex tape showing him having an affair with, I don't know, some chick. So they go to Hollywood and they commission a pornographic film starring a body double who was wearing a very well-made lifelike mask of President Sukarno. And this has all the, usual 1950s Hollywood production values and so on and so forth. So the CIA, they get their little porno film made and they start circulating images from it throughout all these political groups in Indonesia. But the problem is nobody actually cares. This isn't a sensationalist, overhyped news story like it would be here in the United States. And furthermore, I'm guessing that the people of Indonesia aren't stupid. They probably assumed or believed that this was an American plot or a CIA plot, so obviously they don't care. They're going to ignore it. But one person doesn't ignore it. It's actually President Sukarno himself, and it's alleged that when he found out about this, he actually contacted the United States to see if he could get a copy of that tape. Or I guess this being the 1950s, that film reel. And I don't know if they actually sent it to him or not, but as a guy, I guess I can see why he wanted it. To be honest, he probably thought the whole thing was hilarious, and he probably, if he did get that film, he probably filmed it for his friends and stuff. But there you go, there's a few stories about some of the crazy shenanigans that the CIA have gotten up to over the last, 80 years. And I'm sure there are tons of other stories just like that haven't been declassified. But if anybody out there who has worked for the CIA or is working for the CIA is actually listening, go on, declassify some of that funny stuff because I need some source material here. This stuff was hilarious. But as always, I do hope you enjoyed this little kind of bonus episode that I threw together. Stick around because Season 5 is coming up quickly. I believe it's launching on August 23rd, if I'm not mistaken. And I have a lot of great topics and material lined up for that season, so be sure to stick around and check it out. So as always, this is Mike. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.